So help us just first break down really what is the crux of the argument that you two have gotten into.
Well, the crux of the argument is that I'm one of the group of non-conventional economists who argue you can't model the economy without including the role of banks, debt and money. And Krugman's part of the economic establishment, which for 30 or 40 years has got away with arguing you can model a capitalist economy as if it has no banks in it, no money and no debt. And we've been screaming for ages from the sidelines saying, hey, you can't do that. You just don't have a model of capitalism if you don't include those components. Along comes the financial crisis. Characters like me predicted it using models including money, banks and debt. And now Krugman comes along and says, oh, well, I can't see why you should actually bother having models of banks, debt and money in macroeconomics. They're irrelevant. They don't matter to the macroeconomy, which, frankly, there's somebody like me, and I hope most people in the real world gobsmacked because, hey, we're living in the middle of a banking crisis caused by too much debt.
What does the mainstream get wrong about money?
A shorter question, what do they get right about money? Fundamentally, the one thing I find amusing when I talk to non-economists is that they think economists are experts on money. And I then have to explain that they don't have money or banks or debt in their macroeconomic models. And so why not? And so because they've worked out reasons, a priori reasons as to why it shouldn't matter. And my favorite, of course, there is my dear mate, Paul Krugman. Okay, Paul. Who's the main defender of what's called the loanable funds model of how banks operate. And what loanable funds has is banks are called intermediaries. If you read in the economics textbook or you read academic papers by neoclassical economists, they'll talk about banks being intermediaries. They'll talk about the intermediation function, et cetera, and that presents banks as being an agent who introduces a person who wants to borrow money to a person who wants to lend money. So they're basically a go-between. I call it the Ashley Madison theory of banking. And they don't actually want to they're going to be somebody else who will like to do that and I'll charge you a fee for the introduction. That's their vision. And I decided to model that in Minsky because one way to expose how their theories depend upon unrealistic assumptions is to model it and then see what in something which actually makes sense, what my Minsky software does, and then rapidly change it to show that in the real world, banks are not intermediaries. They originate money and debt. That's why I call it the BOM model, bank originated money and debt. And that makes a dramatic difference to macroeconomics. And if you leave banks, debt and money out of your model, you're not modeling capitalism.
They have a vision of how the economy functions that completely leaves banks, private debt and money out of their thinking.
Just say that again, because it's so outlandish.
It is outlandish.
When people hear that, they think, you can't be right. Yeah. You must be a crank. Mainstream economists...
They've literally persuaded themselves you can model capitalism while ignoring the existence of banks, debt and even money. And yet they give advice on how to handle the monetary system.
And they wonder why they're increasingly discredited and some would argue obsolete.
The fundamental thing about neoclassical economics is to say there's no need for a government, there's no need for us to behave collectively, we can all behave as individuals and reach a social nirvana. And I remember writing a first-year paper where I said the world would be better off without trade unions and government, etc., etc. Then what I realised from that is that what an education in economics does is make you into a zealot. Okay? It isn't just teaching you how to analyse a system in some dispassionate sense. In a similar way to Ptolemaic astronomy made you a zealot about the universe having Earth at the centre because that's where God wanted it. Economics makes you believe that the ideal system is disaggregated markets and your role is to get rid of all the elements of the real world that are different to the textbook. Now, that gives you effectively the behaviour, even you think you've justified it. Ironically, all the mathematical work that's been done, including by neoclassicals, is that that doesn't work. But because they wanted it to work so much, they've brought in those mathematical components to jump over problems. And what you've got is a form of cult. And of course, the most dangerous cult is a cult that doesn't realise it is one. And that is fundamentally what I see neoclassical economists as being. Very nice people, But to use a little analogy I actually used in the preface to the second edition of the book, as a school kid, we were had a great school teacher who let us have open discussions and we'd chair the meetings, he'd sit at the back and say nothing. And one day we were discussing some politician and somebody in the class, we're all criticising this guy, and somebody piped up and said, well, at least he's sincere. And everybody in the class said, yeah, we all agreed with that, and nodding our heads sagely. And this teacher piped up from the back of the room and said, don't overrate sincerity. The most dangerous person you'll meet in the world is a person who's sincerely chasing you down the road trying to cut your head off. And in a fundamental way, that's what I see neoclassical economists as being. They have a vision of a perfect world. They're going to lead us there. It's to our own benefit. We're terribly sorry that it's screwed up. No, we're not. We don't believe it has. It's all your fault. We're going to continue reforming it.
So it seems to me that these people don't look, unless the assumptions fit their worldview or what they've modelled and all the rest of it, actually everything else is, there's a selective amnesia.
Yeah, and that is why economists were the ones who didn't see the crisis coming, because I know plenty of people...
And famously, the Queen asked Louis Garicano at the London School of Economics, did no one see it coming?
Well, if this thing's so big, why did nobody see it coming? And the reality is that nobody had to be only no economists of the mainstream, because they get trained to ignore the financial system, ignore banks, ignore debt, ignore money. That's what caused the crisis. Now, ordinary people can say, like, I was looking at the level of mortgage debt or looking at my friends with their credit card debt.
And intuitively they knew.
Intuitively they knew. So the public was better informed and more aware of the potential for a crisis than the profession was.
Because they haven't, gone and done Economics 101 and had their mind bent in that way.
Steve, you also have you asked for a mortgage chart. Here it is. We're going to bring it up and talk to me about what that means.
Let's see. Okay, this is one of several charts that to me simply explains what is still inexplicable to conventional economists, and that is what caused the bubble and what caused it to burst. And on the housing front, what gives you the fundamental core source of demand for housing is new mortgages. So what I'm relating there is new mortgages to the level of house prices. And you can see one and the other are completely overlapping. One drives the other. Mortgage credit drives house prices. And by letting mortgage debt get out of control, which is what the Federal Reserve did quite happily over the 1990 to 2007 period, that's what caused the bubble, and that's what ultimately led to the crash as well. And when the peak of those two lines is when Greenspan told Congress there was no bubble. I mean, credit should be a reasonable part of a well-functioning capitalist economy. The trouble is you let the banks lend and finance Ponzi schemes on housing and shares rather than real investment, which is what the money should be actually created to do. But yeah, if you have credit-based demand and credit's growing faster than GDP, or debt's growing faster than GDP, you ultimately have a crisis because the financial claims on the economy overwhelm the capacity of the economy to pay. And then in the aftermath of that, if you still have a high level of debt, people aren't willing to take on that much credit, banks aren't willing to extend that much, you have a lower level of credit demand, so you can remain in a long-term credit stagnation. It's not secular stagnation, bloody Larry Summers stealing Alan Hansen's term yet again. It's not about, the secular stagnation explanation says we're at low growth because parents aren't having enough kids and engineers aren't having enough ideas. The reality is that, yes, okay, parents aren't having many kids anymore, but the real thing is that credit demand is sluggish because there's too much private debt. So if you wanted to get the economy out of this crisis, you've got to reduce the level of private debt. And if we did that, then I think we'd see a double boost. First of all, credit demand would rise once more, but also the rate of circulation of existing money would rise too, because there's been a very severe decline in the rate of circulation of money. And I would actually relate that to the level of private debt, because when you're carrying private debt, you think I've got to save money and use it to pay my debt down, but your individual act of saving money actually reduces GDP.
It must have been pretty frustrating for you. Your life's work has been trying to reform the dismal science, and almost impossible. Talk about wicked problems.
It's a problem anybody faces when you're trying to shift a way of thinking, complete way of thinking, which philosophers of science call a paradigm. And if you think about back with astronomy, that's the classic instance. You had the vision that came from Ptolemy and from Aristotle that the Earth was the center of the universe and the sun and the planets and the stars all orbited the Earth. That's a paradigm. Now, if you come along and say, look, yes, you can predict the future very accurately with this model, because what they had was the idea of the Earth at the center, planets circling around that on circles, and they were themselves on circles. And if you had circles on circles, like one of those spiralograph things, you can cover any pattern you like in the sky. They could predict really accurately, but they were totally wrong. Now you have Copernicus coming along and saying, look, I think The sun's the centre, and we orbit the sun, and so do the other planets, and God knows about the stars, they've got to be a long way away. That is such a shift that when you're talking to people, it's a complete flip of how you think about the world. And therefore you always face this resistance.
Funnily enough, while you predict meltdown for the European Union, that isn't the real driver of your conviction that there is going to be, before too long, another financial crisis across the world. I mean, that is driven less by a particular political event like the breakup of the European Union for you. It's driven much more by your analysis that the world is still drowning in debt.
Private debt. That's right, and that's what's ignored by the mainstream, which is one reason why I call myself an anti-economist. They are slowly coming around to realising the importance of private debt, but fundamentally they ignore it and say government debt's the problem. My argument is, and it comes from Hyman Minsky's work and Irving Fisher before him, is that private debt is a major, the growth in private debt is a major source of demand in the economy, but that demand comes with the cost that your debt level rises. And there's a tendency in capitalism for the debt level to rise over time to the point where you have so much debt that you can't service it anymore and you have a crisis like we're going through now.
Well, you say can't service it anymore, but the fact is it's very easy to service because right now interest rates are lower than they've ever been before. In some countries they're pretty much negative. And also, governments are making the money supply more sort of easy to get your hands on than ever before.
I wish the
thanks to
last one were true,
easing.
because they're pumping up the money. They're pumping up the money in the banking system's own internal circulation, not in our actual pockets. They should be doing.
Well, it has a knock-on effect. That's the argument.
No, it doesn't. Nothing like it. This is again bad economics.
Well, they wouldn't be doing quantitative easing unless they were convinced that actually printing money as they do,
yes, they're convinced by
it reaches the real economy.
And they're wrong. They're convinced by it, and they're wrong. And the Bank of England is now saying that in its own research papers. If you go back to their thing about money creation in the modern economy, they say boosting reserves does not create extra money in the private monetary system. So it's a fail. It's not a successful policy.
Well,
why won't you? If you cut government spending, why doesn't the economy take off?
The simple, government spending is one of the ways we create money. Okay? People think about the government as if it's like a household, and they think if you've got this a household that spends too much has to eventually go bankrupt, and that's the sort of sound, they call it sound finance, and you can find this right back in the 19th century. But it's the wrong analogy. The whole idea of a government living within its means is exactly the same thing as saying, well, a bank should live within its means. Well, a bank that lived within its means would always give out less in new loans that it took back in repayments and would ultimately shrink to zero, and you wouldn't have any money. And unfortunately, exactly the same thing happens with the government. If it continuously tries to run a surplus, which is what the American government, you know the one time America was incredibly successful in running a sustained surplus?
When?
1921 to 1931.
What happened then?
Gee.
Mainstream economics, through a whole series of accidental failures, has resulted in the theory of economics which is the exact opposite of what they think they're trying to prove, which is about the essential role of the market in enabling a capitalist economy to coordinate without needing an external intelligence to drive it, either central planning on one hand or feudalism on the other. In fact, they've ended up building a model in which the only way it can work is if each last one of us has the intelligence of God. And they still think that's actually addressing what Adam Smith was talking about 2 centuries ago, which is completely wrong. So in the meantime, they've stuck on this ossified idea about an equilibrium approach to the economy, enabling coordination, and everything has to be in equilibrium. We now know that most interesting systems are far from equilibrium, and those techniques have been developed in the physical sciences, the genuine sciences. I'm trying to bring them across to economics. So partly debunking economics is a demolition job, saying these are all the times in which either critics of the mainstream have proven it to be wrong, or the mainstreamers themselves have proven it to be wrong, but fudge the answer. And I describe what neoclassical economists do as not mathematics, but mythematics.
Do you see any signs of coming recessions anytime soon?
On that front, I called a recession for the States in 2020 back when I wrote Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis back then. I still think that there's going to be a downturn, but as I said, it's the turning Japanese syndrome. It's a slump, not a recession, not a serious recession. So because you haven't got a lot of credit-based demand built up, there's not a lot of plunge in credit when credit turns negative. So I saw like a stagnationist thing rather than a serious crisis coming along. The countries that will have a crisis are the ones that borrowed their way through the last one, private debt borrowing, and that includes Australia, Canada, potentially Korea, Sweden, Norway, France. Those are a few of the countries that I think will have a crisis. But in terms of the UK, USA, Spain, all the countries that had a crisis back in 2008, because they're still carrying that legacy of debt, they won't have the same level of credit downturn. So they'll be going for a slump rather than a serious recession. The wild card there is China. China's also one that borrowed its way through the crisis, a huge amount of private debt borrowing, but they're countering that with gigantic government spending. So I see some countries having a credit crisis, but not America, and not something on the scale of 2008.
You're dim on economists, you're dim on the baby boomers, and you're not afraid to say it. But that comes at a price, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, I certainly get ostracised. I'm definitely a traitor to my own age group, and I'm a traitor to my own profession. I'm proud of it because it deserves to be exposed. And this is one reason I wrote Debunking Economics, is because economists will hit you with a whole lot of technical language and make you think you're stupid and don't understand what you're talking about when you raise a legitimate issue like, shouldn't we include the banking sector in economics?
We've heard a lot about austerity and the need to reduce public debt in the run-up to the election from all the main political parties. What's your view on this and their policies?
It's naive. The most positive thing I can say about those views is it's naive and childish. Because they have a vision about how the economy operates that you might as well learn in a kindergarten class. We have Daddy who runs the household, and Daddy has to make sure that enough income comes in, and Daddy has to save, etc. Otherwise, the family will be on the street. And when you look at the way they talk about the government needing to run a surplus, and both parties are really selling this idea, it's really that kindergarten version of what a government and what an economy is like. Now, normally, I have quite a few fights with Paul Krugman, but I've got to say, with a few little nuances, completely agree with the argument he made in The Guardian long read just this last weekend, to say that you can't think about the economy and the government's role in the economy like a child might think about a household budget, which is all that's being sold by both politicians of both sides. And it is the public debt. It's a sign of the state of the economy, but it's not a cause of the state of the economy. And by focusing on that and trying to reduce the public debt, they're likely to push the economy, first of all, into another slump, but also, if they actually succeeded in holding that level of surplus they're both fantasizing about, they'd cause the next financial crisis that way, or cause a serious decline in economic activity. They certainly won't cause what they both argue will cause, which is sustained economic growth. That's
They're business people,
stuff.
and they have to take seriously the words that come out of Paris, for example, or the words that come out of the mouth of the German finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble. These are people in Europe who are saying, look, apart from anything else, to ensure the stabilisation of the rest of the European Union, to ensure we stay together, we have to send a very clear message about Britain that if you leave, you suffer the consequences.
And look what they've done to Greece and Spain. That is not the behaviour of a democratic system. That is authoritarian behaviour.
Well, you can call it what you like, but
do you count?
You're not a politician, you're an economist. You have to calculate.
I'm not going to be an economic Chamberlain.
What do you mean?
I'm not going to be somebody who says we have to stay there for the sake of peace in our time and lock ourselves into a policy system which is actually causing the collapse of Europe. That's what the European Union, in particular the euro, is doing. The sooner the euro is ended, the better for the state of the global economy, and as painful as it will be in transition, the better it will be for the countries of Europe.
Just a final point on Europe, and then we'll move on. But one of your best friends in the world of economic thinking is the former Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis. I've had him in the studio, and he said, you know what, clearly I have a lot of problems with the European Union, but I still think fundamentally it would be the wrong and a dangerous decision for the UK to leave the European Union.
That's where Yanis and I differ on a political front rather than economic. Yanis has got a tendency, and I admire him for it, trying to find ways that currently dysfunctional systems can be made to work. That's what he tried to do with what he called his modest proposal for reforming the euro, which, if it had been taken on board, would have been far, far better for Greece and for most of Europe than what actually was done. I just don't think it can persuade Wolfgang Schäuble to think outside the ordo-liberal framework he's inside. And it's like telling somebody, reform a marriage from inside. Don't leave your husband, persuade him not to bash you anymore. I'm sorry, from what you're even saying here is they're going to bash us more if we try to leave, so let's not leave. That is a very failed strategy for the long term if you're going to continue getting bashed as a result of staying where you are. The level of inequality now, as Piketty pointed out in his master book, is now greater than at any time in history, with
possibly the sole exception of the Gilded Age. So yes, the inequality is driving both poor economic performance and the level of social conflict we're seeing.
This is a critical question, folks, for Global Wall Street. Is inequality driving the financial engineering that got us in a mess in 2004, 2005, and 2006? And Steve, I go back to Simon Johnson up at MIT and the idea in the summer of 2004 where the SEC allowed the banks to re-leverage up.
Yes, I think it's actually a positive feedback, Tom, because the financial engineering is what's actually driven the inequality as well. And then the equality makes it worse until you get a breaking point, which is what 2007 was. But what the Federal Reserve has done quite foolishly by not understanding what caused the crisis in the first place is actually accentuate that crisis, that inequality, through quantitative easing, which has driven up share prices. Great if you own shares, not so great if you don't. And of course, the vast majority of Americans own a trivial amount of shares. It's the wealthy who've benefited. So the Federal Reserve has amplified the inequality caused by the crisis itself. I think Bernie's, I'll go with Bernie's plan. Don't worry about paying for it, because you have, put it this way, nobody fought, in the British government fought against the scale of the deficit in 1940 on the basis that it bankrupt the economy, because if they hadn't had a deficit of 40% of GDP, they would have been speaking German 1 year later. So when you face an existential threat, you don't worry about what it's going to cost. Existence is what you're trying to preserve.
Yeah.
So, but in terms of Bernie's plan, I'd far rather see that being done than not. Go for it. But the sooner we start doing it, the more of a chance we have to cope during the panic we're going to face in the future.
Not as badly as Bernanke. I don't think Bernanke's got the same personal hang-ups that Greenspan has, but again, Bernanke has a book out which is called The Courage to Act. And as I said a long time ago, I wish he had the courage to think.